As Nana mentioned, I'm CHERN Science Communication Manager, and it is really a pleasure and an honor to be moderating today. Our second China-Europe Research Highlights is focused on Chinese investments in Northern Europe, a topic that we haven't discussed in this forum so far. The title of today's Research Highlights is Foreign Investments and Security, a Nordic Perspective on China's Rise. And we have three excellent speakers. Well, one unfortunately isn't with us physically today, but she has prepared a presentation which will be presented by her colleagues. They are all from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. We have Morten Andersen, who is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. He's the project leader of the project that's going to be presented today. Our second speaker, who is unfortunately not with us today, but her presentation is I guess, the economic part of the team, and that's Hege Medin, a senior researcher, whose main research field is international economics, and her research frequently involves statistical analysis of registered data, which is, I think, a very interesting part of today's presentation. And last but certainly not least, we have the director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs himself, Ulf Sverdrup, and he holds a doctoral degree in political science from the University of Oslo and was a professor at the Norwegian Business School, BI, and a research professor at ARENA, Center of European Studies at the University of Oslo. He has published widely on various topics in international politics. And Ulf will be sort of leading the distribution of presentations today between the three different aspects that will be presented. I do hope we will have interesting discussion after the presentation. And I will now give the floor to Ulf.
Okay, thank you so much, Yelena, and thanks to Nana and to the CHERN family for inviting us and for letting us have this great opportunity to present some of our findings and early results from a research project that we call COINS. So COINS is an acronym. It's a fancy acronym because it fits this. The longer title is the consequences of foreign investments for national security. So the abbreviation is COINS. So this is a research project that runs from early to late 2019 until 2024. It's funded by the Norwegian Research Council, and it combines researchers from the Institute, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and the University of Oslo, the law faculty, and also a set of international partners. One of the purposes of the project is to bring together insights from different disciplines. So we have economists, political scientists, and lawyers to look into some of the difficulties and challenges involved in managing or governing foreign investment flows. The purpose today is twofold. One is to present to you some early results that we think are quite interesting. And secondly, to signal to the rest of the community of researchers that, hey, we are here, we are eager to cooperate with you. And if you are interested in doing similar research, etc., please join in, reach out to us, and we are sure that we can develop some interesting insights. Now, we will look primarily at Northern European economies, and there are some special things with Nordic economies because they are small. They are also more open, so they are competitive in global markets. So they have been, let's say, advocates of a rather open economy. And they have a high influx of inwards foreign direct investments, but these countries are also investing quite a lot in other countries. So they have an outward interest also in allowing of outward foreign direct investment. Now, as Yelena said, Hege Medin, or a brilliant economist, unfortunately fell ill this morning, so she's not with us. So bear in mind that I'm not the same trained economist as she is, but I will try my best to present some of her results. So the presentation from our side is organized into 4 or 5 different segments. First, Morten Andersen will present to you, who's the leader of the project, will present some of the backdrop and some of the key developments around foreign direct investments, and in particular from China. into European economies and in general, and to the Norwegian economy and Nordic economies in particular. And then I will present some of the data that we have gathered on investment flows into Norway, that Hege and Medin, a more econometric analysis. And then I will present some results from a survey we have conducted in all Nordic countries about attitudes and perceptions of foreign investments, particularly from China, into Nordic economies. And then Morten Andersen, my colleague, again will wrap it up with presenting some of the governance challenges and some of the legal changes that have been made in these countries, and some of the difficulties in governing and regulating and screening foreign direct investments in general, and from China in particular. So that's the plan for the next 35 minutes or so. So now I give the floor to Morten to please prepare the slides, and then you can take over from here. Morten.
Thank you, Ulf. Let's see if I manage this. Excellent. Good afternoon or good morning to some of you, perhaps. And thank you for this opportunity to share, to talk about and discuss our research that we are doing at the moment. And as Ulf said, the title pretty much captures what we're doing, right? The consequences of investments for national security. And one of the reasons why this project was initiated and is relevant and why it got funded is the increasing attention to the security aspects of foreign investments, the consequences. And that attention is increasing, and in particular concerning investments from China, right? So this actually came on the agenda pretty quickly. If you look at this, which are statements from the EU Commission. In 2008, establishing a screening mechanism, the Commission stated, would send a misleading signal that the EU is stepping back from its commitment to an open investment regime. Then in 2017, they voiced concerns about foreign investors. Whilst most recently in 2020, they are now talking about screening and protecting the collective security of the European Union. So this development happened quite quickly. And one important reason for this change is, if you have a look at this, Chinese investments into Europe is now 50 times larger now than in 2008. It has gone from about 840 million euros in 2008 to 42 billion, dollars, from 840 million dollars to 42 billion dollars in 2018, which is roughly 35 billion euro. And Chinese investors have taken control of about 350 European companies over the past 10 years. But still the percentage of all investments that are Chinese is still relatively low. It's about 2.5%, whereas I think the US accounts for something like 40% of the foreign investments into Europe. And as we speak, the volume of Chinese investments into Europe has been slowing down, measured in terms of the value of investments per year. But in absolute terms, China's presence in Europe is increasing, right? But the more spectacular thing here is really the timing, right? There's this rapid rise at a time when foreign investments globally are declining after the financial crisis. So just after the financial crisis, we see Chinese investments into Europe skyrocketing. And there are, of course, indications that this is a conscious strategy to use foreign investments as part of the political toolbox, as it were. So to get a grip on the dilemmas we inevitably will meet when talking about controlling or screening such investments, we need to keep in mind that there are potential risks, but also large benefits involved with investments from other countries. So what are the main benefits that come from receiving foreign investments into your country? Obviously, you get money, right? Capital. And you can get inflows of new technology, knowledge, competence, and you might get access to new and larger markets. And since we are talking about Norway and the Nordic countries, I have some examples of all of this from Norway and the industrialization of Norway, because at the beginning of the 20th century, Norwegians had these big visions that they wanted to produce fertilizer, electrical power, metals like aluminium, but to realize this and to get what one wished for, there wasn't enough money, simply speaking, in Norway to invest. So we hadn't saved enough, basically. So when building up these, what is nationally in Norway famous industries like Hydro, Yara International, Elkem, our industrial pioneers depended on foreign money to get their things going. So the very industrialization of Norway was mainly financed from abroad. That applied also to Norwegian oil in the 60s and 70s. Building the petroleum industry depended on capital, but above all on technology and competence and experience from large petroleum companies abroad. So how do we get the oil up from there, right? We didn't know. And in these examples from Norwegian recent history, foreign investments came from countries like Sweden, France, Germany, the United States, and this has been the norm. Most foreign investments have moved from rich countries to other rich countries, or from rich countries to developing countries. So it's only in the past decade that we have seen massive investment streams coming from untraditional countries like China, Russia, and the Gulf states. So what is the difference? One important difference with these new countries, if you can say that, is that these are countries with which Norway and many other countries cannot have any security cooperation. Like we're in an alliance with the US, we have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, we train with our allies, we share information and intelligence and so on with a lot of countries, but with China we have nothing of the sort, and that is a big difference, evidently. And there's another major difference, because traditionally one would consider the motives for those investing internationally to be profit, right? Making money. They are private corporations, and what they want to do is to make a profit. And that is also why investments is an area that is barely regulated at all, as opposed to trade, for instance, where we have rules for customs, we have free trade agreements, we have the World Trade Organization, and so on. And there's nothing similar when it comes to international investments. The field is basically open. So then, with China, for instance, we see that if we follow investment chains all the way back to where it originated, the ultimate owner might be the Chinese state. And states, as we know, can have a range of goals beyond making money. So it can be the national interest, and that would be quite a different calculus from profit. One based on a long-term understanding of how the state can gain power, right? So in the midst of this free, unregulated space, suddenly state actors appear, or might appear, because the border between what is public and what is private is more blurry often in these countries. And many think then that this is a security challenge. And why is that? You can say there are three types of risks that foreign investments may pose. You can become dependent on foreign companies or ultimately other states for things that are essential for your society to work, for absolutely critical goods and services. And particularly now during the pandemic, we see how dependent we are, right, on everything from hospital equipment to masks, not to speak of vaccines. But there might be similar items that would be equally crucial for the military or the supply of electricity and so on, infrastructure of all sorts. So one risk is simply to become dependent on essential goods, dependent on foreign entities for things that are critical for society to work. And secondly, technology and knowledge may leave the country and be transferred to foreign companies that might be controlled by other states, which in turn might use this technology and this knowledge against your interests. And of course, you have the purely economic aspects that you might lose competitive advantages, innovations, and so on. And lastly, we have the more classical risky business like infiltration, surveillance, espionage, or one might even sabotage your goods and services that are critical, right? And we might add also that buying and controlling media organization would be another risk. As we know, disinformation, fake news, propaganda is rather popular these days. I'm not saying that these are actual large risks in letting China invest in Norway or in general in any other country, but it is a new element. That is the point. It's a new element that one will have to consider, even if it's unlikely. And at the same time, having mechanisms in place to deal with such risks and being just aware of this will also work as a deterrence. So it's a bit like a metal detector at the airport or screening at the airport, right? The trick is to detect the investments that might potentially be a risk, and then let all the other investments flow pretty freely to reap the benefits from them, or even let them skip the metal detector altogether. But what should set off this proverbial metal detector? How sensitive should this metal detector be in the case of foreign investments, which is not easy to find that balance. That is really tricky, and that is basically the main dilemma in this project. How can we reap the benefits from being an open society, having an open economy, and which we have in Norway and in the Nordic countries, whilst at the same time secure our legitimate security interests? That is the key dilemma. But it gets more tricky because what is really our legitimate security interest? What is our national interest or critical infrastructure, stuff like that? That is not self-evident. So how broad should this definition be? So it's, for instance, for a long time it's been clear that military stuff is a critical sector in society, right? Defense installations, weapons manufacturing, stuff that has to do directly with the military, and also probably electricity supply, internet, stuff like that is critical and is part of societal security. But what about jobs? About capacity for innovation and competition, airlines, railways, farming, agriculture, the environment, right? So how critical is this? And is it critical enough to potentially block investments in these areas? And what would the economic consequences of this be? How much of the wanted positive investments would we miss and discourage them? So, and not the least, how many administrative resources would you need to go through all these investments in all these sectors, right? And talking of that, it's only the start, because then you have to devise some kind of system to know precisely how to screen stuff, how to control stuff, how to revise risky investments in the most efficient way. I'll look at that a bit later. So these are the challenges, right? But just now in Norway, and what we're doing in this project is another challenge, which is basically to map the terrain. What does the terrain look like? And what kinds of investments do we receive into Norway? And as mentioned, Hege couldn't be here with us, so Ulf will give it a go. Ulf?
Okay, thanks.
I'm sharing my screen, just hold on for a second.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Morten. And now I will try to share my screen. Hopefully that will work. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, it works well.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Okay, obviously I'm not Hege Medin, but I will try my best to present some of the data. As Morten said, one of the points in our project is to just map out the scale of foreign direct investment in Norway. And this is not an easy exercise. So, but what we have done is to build a database of all companies that are controlled by foreign and so what we call foreign, what are called foreign controlled enterprises. So that is companies that have at least 50% ownership share that is foreign. And in this database, we have tracked down, so we have the ultimate owner country of each company. So for instance, if a Dutch company is invested in Norway, but this Dutch company is owned by, let's say, a Chinese company, that is then coded in our data set as being ultimately owned by the Chinese company. And this is not always easy to identify, but the Norwegian data in Statistics Norway are pretty good. And we have been able to triangulate also various data sets in order to create this database. So we have in our database now all companies in Norway. And in the Norwegian economy, we have large sectors in the economy with a very high presence of foreign-owned enterprises, particularly in oil and gas, in retail and trade, and in manufacture, etc. And I think it's important, I can show you here in this data how these foreign-owned enterprises are spread out in many sectors. So the red columns here indicate foreign-owned enterprises, and the blue ones are Norwegian-owned enterprises. So just by having a glance at the data, you will see that around 1/3 of companies are owned by our foreign-owned enterprises. And you see that in some sectors, they are between, let's say, between 30 and 40% of the companies are foreign-owned enterprises. And this is just a testimony to what Morten Andersen just said, that in the Norwegian economy, but also in other Nordic economies and in European economies in general, there are huge parts of our economies that are operated by foreign-owned enterprises, foreign-controlled enterprises. Now, if we see that, look at which countries are the most important investor countries. So there's no, by far, there's no doubt that by far the most important investors are EU, EFTA countries, and then followed by in general, and then Sweden, because Sweden is so big. So the Swedes are in a kind of special category here. You see that on the red line in the middle there. And then you see the USA is pretty high. So the traditional high income countries are owning a lot in the Norwegian economy, particularly EA countries and the US. Interestingly enough, you see fairly stable levels across time here from 2013 until 2018. I should say that in our data set, we are now updating, so we continue this data series from 2018 and onwards. But if you look at what we could call untraditional investor countries, what we call coins countries. So for our purposes, we call them coins countries, that is China, Russia, and Gulf Cooperation Council states. We see that the blue line, that's the Chinese investments of foreign-owned companies, enterprises. We see there is quite a bit of increase, in particular from China. they have become the most important, whereas Russia and Gulf state countries are much less important if we consider enterprise size. If we move on, we see on this table here is it shows that around 6% of the enterprises, if you count just the number of enterprises, are foreign-owned enterprises. But interestingly, these companies that are foreign-owned enterprises account for around 24% of employees in Norway. And interestingly enough, they have a higher turnover than other companies in Norway. So it's around 30%. In addition to this, we have looked into the data set, and what we have found is that companies from China are also significantly, they are more profitable and larger also than the average companies from other enterprises owned by other countries. So this is what we have looked at the database. So it means that if the Norwegian economists and politicians wants to regulate foreign investments, it's a really difficult job, because we have so many foreign investments already, foreign-owned enterprises already in our economy, and we would like to have many foreign-owned enterprises in our economy. Now, let me move on to also share briefly some data on a survey that we have done on attitudes to foreign investments in the Nordic countries. We did this in August 2019, and we asked around 5,000 people in Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. And Morten and myself has written this up in a more comprehensive article, but it's also published as a small brief on European Council of Foreign Relations pages, where we present some of the key findings here. But I can just present them briefly to you. So in general, we find that the population in the Nordic countries have a mixed view or attitude towards foreign investments. Some are positive and some are also negative. Many are kind of slightly reluctant, but they're leaning towards a positive attitude. The Swedes and the Danes are more positive, whereas people on Iceland are very negative to foreign investments. In general, we also see that men are more supportive of foreign investments than women. Younger people are more supportive, and people with higher education and higher income are more supportive of foreign investments than people that have less education and less income. We asked this question because we were curious about whether people are reluctant towards Chinese investments, or whether they are reluctant to all kinds of investments, whether there are some kind of protectionist sentiment in the population. We find that people in all these countries have a fairly positive attitude to EU investments from EU countries. Probably could have added the US here as well, but they have a much more negative attitude to investments from Russia and China. And interestingly, for the CHERN network, I think, is that the sentiment seems to be more negative to investments from Russia than China. And the graph here to the left, we had the different countries, and we have ranked them on an index where 0 would be very negative and 100 would be very positive. So you see that in general, citizens have a kind of leaning towards positive in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark on investments from the EU, whereas they are more critical on investments from Russia, that is the light blue or gray, and China, that is the red columns. Finland and Sweden are least negative to investment from China, whereas Norway and Iceland are probably most negative sentiment. But you see quite the same pattern in all countries and not that much country variation. It's also interesting to see that citizens seem to distinguish between investments in various sectors. So unfortunately, some of these graphs are difficult to read. They're also in Norwegian, but I can translate them for you. So you see in the bottom, you see investments, foreign investments in sectors that we can call natural resources. That could be oil and gas, hydroelectricity, forests, etc. in Sweden and Finland. There you see that there's a general negative sentiment to foreign investments, be them from the EU or from Russia or China. They're very negative attitudes to such investments in natural resources from China and Russia, but also slightly negative on investments from the EU. And then you see that there's not so negative attitudes to investments in retail or in technology or in infrastructure. And then we ask those people who say they are negative to investments from China, we ask them, why are you reluctant, or why do you have negative attitudes to Chinese investments? And here I think it's interesting that there are different and many reasons that are provided. Some and the most frequently reported response is basically loss of control with natural resources. And then secondly, there are concerns about security. But almost equally important are concerns about corruption, negative environmental effects, or even fear or more difficult working conditions. There we observe some slight country variation. So in Norway, people tend to be leaning slightly more towards concerns about security, whereas in Finland, people are more concerned about negative environmental impacts of Chinese investments. We also observe some variation in different segments of the population. So people that are 50 years old or older, they seem to be more concerned with natural resources and more concerned about security risks, whereas younger people, they have less concerns about security, and they are more concerned about negative environmental effects or more difficult or more harmful working conditions. So to sum up the results from this survey, we seem to find that there's fairly strong support for foreign investments, but some reluctance even in these Nordic countries that have generally open economies. The Nordics are rather positive to European investments, but rather negative to investments from Russia and China. This means that I don't think it's fair to say that the Nordic economies are protectionist in themselves, but they are particularly reluctant to investment from Russia and China. And what we have identified as well is that there is considerable variation in attitudes depending on sectors of the economy, and they see multiple risk factors associated with Chinese investments. These findings, I think they are important for governments. This is a signal about legitimacy and the foundation, the legitimacy foundation for their attempts at screening and restricting and regulating foreign investments. And now I give the floor to Morten to say a few more words about those aspects. Morten.
Thank you, Ulf.
Okay, I'll try to take this down.
Yeah, I've done it.
Yeah.
So we've been through the challenges. We've been through what the terrain looks like in the Nordic countries in terms of investments and in terms of opinion. And now to the difficult part, the solution, what do we do? The term we have been using is screening, right? And screening foreign investments basically means that you have processes to evaluate the risk associated with foreign investments, and you do this to protect national security or national interest or national function, some variation thereof. But there are, of course, a massive amount of investments, and you cannot screen them all. So at some point you need to decide, right, what do you do? You have to filter out those investments that pose a risk. So how do different countries go about this? What most countries, if not all, have in common is that there are basically two steps to this process of screening. First, you have to identify more generally, more abstractly, investments. What kinds of investments would be potentially problematic? And in this step, you would basically not be looking at any investments, concrete investments at all, but you would use general criteria, general definitions. Countries would place the markers, so to speak, the markers limiting off the kinds of investments that are to be considered potentially risky. And typically you would make a list of sectors, of critical sectors. You would make some definition of your national interests, or even concrete companies could go on such a list, which we'll look at that in a second. But in the second step is where the screening proper is taking place, where these potentially harmful investments are limited further down to specific and concrete transactions, examples of investments that might be an actual security risk, right? That may or may not pass a screening process. So this second step is where you have some institution, a board, something like that, that sits down and goes through the proposal, the history, the data, and so on, and follow up. And then you arrive at the decision, a conclusion. And there are some options. An investment might be blocked, not allowed, which is extremely rare that an investment is blocked publicly. In Canada, for instance, I think since they implemented their legislation, relevant legislation in 2009, they have screened about 5,000 transactions for national security purposes, and less than 1% of those transactions led to any kind of sanction or risk reducing measures. So it's pretty rare. So far, we have been looking mainly at these countries, Australia, Canada, Finland, France, the Netherlands, Great Britain, Germany, the United States, and also the EU, to see what are they doing, what are the challenges they face, and so on. And I will obviously not go through all of these countries now, but briefly, we see that all these countries have relevant laws, relevant systems in place, and this has happened very quickly. And all countries have made adjustments to the application of these laws, generally making them more strict, particularly now during the pandemic. You also see that the definitions of what security means, what security is, as I mentioned, how do we define this, how broad, they are expanding. So laws and regulations, they become more detailed, more mature. They are applied to ever more segments and sections of the economy, and the thresholds for when screening kicks in are generally lowered. Also, this particularly now during the pandemic. So altogether, in this balance that we talked about between economic openness on the one hand and security measures on the other, we see that security measures are weighted more and more now. So what decides whether a transaction should be screened or not? This evidently depends on the country and the domestic legal context and so on. But most often it's something like the size of the investment itself, the size of the target company that is sought bought or controlled. Some have more fluid definitions of what control means. It might be that you have some seat on the board, seat at the table in general, the possibility indirectly to influence the company and so on, independent of any concrete thresholds. Also, real estate property is often screened. Then when they are close to military, typically military bases or airports, stuff like that, or the kinds of critical infrastructure. And nationality is interesting because that's not a formal criterion most of the time, but particularly the United States are at least almost indirectly hinting that China is of special interest in this regard, and you also see that in the numbers when you the CFIUS, which is the organ screening investments in the US, are screening much more Chinese investments than from any other nation. Some countries also have, which makes this a bit complicated, they have parallel processes where they look at competition laws, net benefit assessments, or the like more the purely economic aspects. Do we gain from this, right? But all of these countries have general thresholds that applies to all investments. And you have specific thresholds that are normally lower for in the form of lists or categories of particularly exposed sectors or functions of companies, lists of critical sectors, where you have stricter criteria and lower threshold for screening to kick in. And they often also include stuff like notification requirements, that the buyer must notify the authorities if planning to invest in one of these sectors. And just to illustrate this, I have gathered a handful of these critical categories from different countries here for you to have a quick look at. So it's a lot of different stuff. It's everything from gambling to face masks. So if you want to invest in any of these sectors, industries, it is counted as a critical sector with higher requirements in different countries. It's often with far stricter requirements. But even if this is a long list, and it's by no means a complete list, one can ask if there is something we are missing here. Because the laws that are in use are often based on regulation that has existed for a long time before the security aspects of foreign investments became so prominent. So in some cases, we can see this reflected, for instance, in many thresholds, it's all about, as I mentioned, size. Before, size was a major variable, right? Big companies and large sums of money would have potentially large consequences. The bigger the transaction, the bigger the consequences, basically. And that was so particularly because of concerns over cartels, monopolies. That was the basis of the original laws, right? Based on antitrust laws. So these big things could take over the economy, basically. And some of this sticks today. But what about the really small things? What about the small tech startups that might not be worth anything yet, but that possess potentially crucial knowledge and technology, or the developer that is traveling abroad on an exchange with another company, or companies that are leasing equipments and so on. You have stuff that is less reflected in some of these processes, the flow of people, the flow of concrete individuals of knowledge that are not necessarily the result of a direct control of a company or acquisitions or holding a majority of shares and so on. So collaborations and informal contact between companies that falls far below any screening threshold might, in theory at least, be equally or even more risky than massive big investments. So these global flows are often more and more made up by knowledge and technical know-how, right, rather than capital and infrastructure. And conversely, there is the danger of going too far, which we have already alluded to. The screening mechanisms are much more in use now than before, and we see that the definitions of national security, critical infrastructure, as mentioned, are steadily expanded. So security concerns are much more prominent in the global economy now, much more. And combined with some of the other political developments we see concerning protectionism, economic nationalism, anti-globalization movements, and so on, states may turn more inwards and become more, say, isolated, right? So because of this context, it's particularly important to consider, we think, proportionality. How big is the risk actually, and how broad do we need national interest to be defined for this particular purpose? Efficiency, by defining the way we do and by screening what we do. Do we actually achieve our stated goals? And when do we slip into other political purposes that has less to do with legitimate security concerns? The key here is to avoid screening mechanisms becoming a means for other, often domestic political purposes. Closest would be, protectionist sentiments, which is tricky because blocking investments is fully legal, right? It's completely legal according to international law, so it's like the last stand of protectionism in the international economy. So it's tempting to use this for other purposes, which in turn has to do with legitimacy, both internal and externally. Internally, it has to do with what Ulf has been talking about, right? Public support, like we touch upon in the survey. But also it's important to communicate rules and regulations very clearly to potential investors. But another way, screening must be properly institutionalized. And a further reason for institutionalizing and operationalizing security laws and screening in the clearest way possible is to avoid undue influence from pressure groups, which is another challenge, and lobbyists perhaps wanting to block this or that investment, or even more likely, protect this or that national sector, right? And to avoid this, institutionalizing these mechanisms properly is important. And in addition, you have the reputational concern, which is important. One does not want to be blocked. So if a company, as I said, it's incredibly rare that blocking an investment, it happens publicly. So if you think as an investor that this is a possibility, but you don't really know, it's better to avoid the potential risk, right? So the rules should be clear. You don't want to take the risk of actually be blocked. You have to look to know what the terrain looks like. And in terms of implementing such systems with all these challenges, it seems that other countries in Europe and globally have come further than the Nordic countries in institutionalizing such screening mechanisms. Yet again, all countries are really struggling, right, to find this right balance, the right thresholds, the right definitions, and the right level of resources to spend on this task. So even if the formal stuff, the laws and everything is in place, this will have to be practiced consistently, which is a huge challenge. And I think things are still a bit unclear all over the board, and also in Norway. Which leads us to some concluding remarks. Investments from China and Russia are increasing. and not only that, we also see that the investments made are big and profitable, at least in Norway, as Ulf explained. We also see the popular sentiment showing reluctance towards Chinese investments. There are efforts being made to instill these mechanisms for screening investments, but as I just said, they are difficult to implement, and it's crucial to have these be transparent and predictable. And there's one dilemma in all of this, if moving one level up, so to speak, to the global level, is that those states screening the most and implementing the most thorough laws are the very states that helped establish the open liberal economic world order to begin with, right? And they are behaving now in ways that might carry an economic risk for themselves. This means that the general balance is shifting from an open and liberal international economy towards more barriers to investments and larger emphasis on the security aspect of investments. Which leads us back to where we started, the dilemma that foreign investments are particularly important for us small Nordic countries, right? So we should be careful not to go too far. We depend on a stable international order and an open investment regime, both when it comes to receiving foreign investments, but also because we invest abroad. So it's important to avoid this protectionism that we mentioned, this conceptual stretching of what security means and should be taken to mean in this context. Thank you.
Thank you for really fascinating presentations, and you really inspired the audience as well. We have already quite a few questions in the chat queue, and we have plenty of time now to start a discussion, but we will now say goodbye to our online audience.